want to make you one promise in this episode, and it is that this isn't a political episode. It is an episode about politics. I know that there are a lot of raw feelings right now, and that is rightfully so. I've said this before in previous episodes, but discussing my own political opinion is not relevant in any way to this podcast. However, in the wake of the results of the 2024 election, I think that it would be foolish to discount the significance that podcasting played in this election and in politics moving forward. In this episode, we're going to dissect the use of podcasts by both candidates, talk about what worked, what didn't, and how we can use the lessons of both campaigns to grow our own podcasts and shape our brands through podcasting. Hello and welcome to Podcast for Profit. My name is Morgan Franklin. I'm a podcast producer, strategist, and educator. This podcast will help you create and grow a podcast that cuts through the noise of social media and speaks directly to your target audience. If you're ready to create a podcast that will align you with the experts in your industry, position yourself as a trusted leader, and create another source of revenue for your business, you're in the right place. I want to provide you this information as unbiased and fairly as possible because not only am I a volunteer election worker, but also I'm someone that believes in the will of the people. Through our vote, we all have an equal voice. And I respect that right, no matter what party is being discussed. Whether you're satisfied or dissatisfied with the results of this election, it is clear that one candidate was using podcasts to share their message and reach new audiences in a way that we have never seen before in a political race. And this was never clearer to me than on the actual election day on Tuesday. As I said, I work as a volunteer election worker, and this is my fourth presidential election working at the polls. Like every year, people are excited. Election day is such an exciting day, and you would be hard-pressed to find anyone at the polls on election day that is not excited to be there. And, I was having a conversation before the polls opened with a fellow volunteer that was there, and we were just talking. She asked me what I did. I said that I was a podcast producer, and before she could even take a breath to ask me anything else, she just says, "Oh my gosh, my son just turned 18. He's voting for the first time, and he's listened to every single podcast episode with Donald Trump. He loves podcasts." And I was intrigued to hear this because, you're thinking about first-time voters, the youth vote rallied by podcasts with Donald Trump. Just really interesting. The candidate that would technically be our oldest candidate ever elected as president at the time of his inauguration was reaching Gen Z voters through podcasting. Like, how was that possible, right? Well, let's take a look. So here's a list of every podcast that Donald Trump guested on during his campaign for president during the 2024 election. And I'm going to go in chronological order because there are quite a few of them from June 2024 to October 2024 with just a brief summary of topics covered and the length of that episode. First is Impulsive with Logan Paul in June of 2024. So Donald Trump made his podcasting debut with Logan Paul, who is a social media influencer and professional wrestler, on the Impulsive podcast. And during this episode, he discussed topics like AI and even how he uses AI in his own speech writing. This interview was 53 minutes long. Fast forwarding 2 months later, guesting on the This Past Weekend with Theo Von podcast in August of 2024, they're kind of talking about a little bit more personal topics, like Donald Trump's decision to abstain from alcohol and smoking, and how his life of sobriety has been influenced by his brother's Fred's struggles, who died of substance abuse at only 42. This episode was about 1 hour long. Next, in September of 2024, Donald Trump was featured on the Lex Fridman podcast, where he discussed his views on things like medical marijuana, losing the 2020 election, China, Joe Rogan, and a variety of other very current topics. This episode was 1 hour and 3 minutes long. In early October 2024, Donald Trump goes on the Flagrant podcast with Andrew Schultz, where he talks about abortion and reiterating his stance that decisions on abortion rights should be left to the states. This episode was about 1 hour and 30 minutes long. On October 14th, Full Send podcast host Donald Trump for a discussion on Elon Musk, World War III, his message to first-time voters, and if he's going to be on the Joe Rogan podcast or not, which I thought was pretty interesting. This episode was 38 minutes long. Next, Bussin' with the Boys. In mid-October of 2024, Trump appears on Bussin' with the Boys, which is a podcast by the media company Barstool Sports, where during the interview, he discussed his motivations for entering politics, including his concerns about border security and trade deals. This episode was 2 hours and 15 minutes long. On October 17th, Donald Trump joins PBD podcast with Patrick Bet-David. On this episode, he discusses domestic enemies and expresses his own concerns for Kamala Harris' political stances. This episode is 1 hour and 26 minutes long. On October 21st, Donald Trump talks pro wrestling and election with 6 Feet Under with Mark Calloway, a.k.a. The Undertaker. He's famously the most tenured wrestler in WWE history. And lastly, I'm sorry, I know this list is long, of course, the now infamous episode of the Joe Rogan Experience in late October 2024. Donald Trump appeared on Joe Rogan's podcast, engaging in a wide variety of discussions that included topics like Robert E. Lee's military strategy and speculation about life on Mars. This episode was 2 minutes shy of being 3 hours long. And the totally crazy thing to think about is combined for all of these episodes, these podcasters have delivered a watch total of over 50 million views on YouTube alone. So that's not even podcast downloads in the traditional way that we think of them. That's not streams. That's not anything else. That's just views on YouTube. And that is absolutely insane to me. And this might be obvious from their introductions, but all of the hosts are male and carry a consistently male-centered audience. And while I've listened to clips from all these podcasters, I do not claim to be fully equipped to speak on their audiences any more than just to say, I do believe they are targeted at young to middle-aged men, and they are doing an excellent job. Like, it is all executed flawlessly. Also, I want to acknowledge that there were many other live Twitch events and streaming and radio shows, and I did not include them here. I was trying to keep it strictly podcast-oriented, but Donald Trump was staying very busy on podcasts and streaming circuits. No one can say he was not putting in the time there on podcasts, because absolutely he was. So let's take a look at Kamala Harris and how the Harris campaign used podcasting to help share their message and draw in those voters that might not have known the vice president very well up until this point. On September 30th, Kamala Harris joined Alex Cooper on Call Her Daddy, which is Spotify's second most popular podcast in the United States, and also has about 1 million subscribers on YouTube. During this episode, Kamala Harris spoke about the grit that it takes for a woman to seek public office, the toughness that her mother instilled in her, and the importance of reproductive rights in this election. This episode was roughly 40 minutes long. Again, airing on September 30th, Kamala Harris joined All the Smoke with NBA champions Steven Jackson and Matt Barnes to discuss the Harris plan to boost the economy and her perspective on America's progress on social justice. Next, on October 28th, Kamala Harris joined Brené Brown on Unlocking Us with Brené Brown for a conversation on the strength and fragility of democracy, the power of strong coalitions, and how to commit to justice and fairness that can both ground us and drive action. That interview was 1 hour long. And a lot like Donald Trump, Kamala Harris did appear on a variety of radio shows and other media like The Howard Stern Show, The Steve Harvey Morning Show, and The Breakfast Club. When we look at the overall listener audience of the Harris features, it shows a much more diverse story than Donald Trump and where he was featured, but a far less consistent one. And again, I've listened to clips from the podcasts, and I do not claim to know the full analysis of their audience. But when I'm looking at these 3 podcasts specifically, and we see their target audiences are young women, young to middle-aged men, and middle-aged women, you're casting a wide net, but not really driving home the message to any specific person. Here's my perspective on why podcasting really worked for Donald Trump in this election cycle, and it didn't for Kamala Harris. What do I always say about podcasting? Know your audience. Know your audience. Both these candidates do know their audience, but they are speaking to them in totally different ways. And in all fairness, Kamala Harris had a much broader area to cover, seeing as the country was just getting to know her in about 100 days. That's a lot of work to do. That's a lot of people to speak to. However, it does not mean that your message is reaching the targeted audience. In the upcoming weeks and months, you're going to hear a lot about the significance of paid, owned, and earned media. And for the reasons that I've discussed in this episode, let's take a look at each one of these and talk about what they really mean. Let's start with paid media. You pay for it. So that can be anything from a Facebook ad to a billboard. Anything you pay for that is getting your message out there. Next is owned media. And owned media is anything that you create, for example, a TikTok video that you made or a blog post you wrote, your own podcast. Any content or media that you create and post and own yourself is owned media. Lastly is earned media. Earned media is the trickiest, but I would argue the most important media for gaining consumer or voter trust in the digital age. People are smart. They don't trust ads. Yeah, they don't trust ads anywhere, and they don't trust you. Audiences are very wary, and do you blame them? This is why earned media is so important, and whether you like it or not, Donald Trump did a spectacular job of capitalizing on earned media. I've heard some speculation around that his youngest son, Barron Trump, is a big fan of podcasting and some of the podcasts that he went on, but regardless, he knew who his audience was, and he was able to use that earned media that he got to speak directly to this audience. Donald Trump is amazing at this, and he has been for most of his life. And whether it's magazines or TV or any kind of media that he can shape and mold to his narrative, he is very hands-on with the media. Does he hate them? Yeah, most of the time. But also, it is his secret weapon because he can use that earned media to accomplish the things that he is trying to do. Looking at the Harris campaign and how Kamala Harris used podcasting, I'm not 100% sure it was used in the best way, even for the small amount that she utilized the platform. If I could give some constructive criticism and my own thoughts, it would be this. Get in character. Get in the environment. When I watched the Call Her Daddy interview, it was unlike any of the other episodes of that podcast that I had ever watched. But not necessarily in a good way. It felt very buttoned up, which I'm not saying is a bad thing. I'm not saying that if your podcast is buttoned up that that's bad. I'm saying that it wasn't the Call Her Daddy brand. It felt very disingenuous to the experience of listening or watching that particular podcast. And I know that they were hosting the Vice President of the United States, right? You got to be a little bit more professional, but maybe it was either that was the wrong show for Kamala Harris, or her team should have worked with the podcast to create a little bit more laid back environment for everyone. It felt forced in a way. And especially for this to be one of the only long form pieces of media that the Kamala Harris campaign put out that wasn't a primetime interview, I think it could have been optimized to yield better results. All right, so we've covered the good and the bad. I am grateful to these campaigns for using podcasting as part of their election strategy. I think that was incredibly smart. I made this joke on TikTok last week that sometimes as a podcaster, that podcasting can feel like the coolest and lamest thing about you. And I think that is really true. What I want you to take away from this episode, an election is that podcasting is legitimate. As cliche as it might be for me to say, people don't trust media. People trust people. People trust connections. And no matter how many millions or billions a campaign spends on ads, it can't create the same connection as sitting down with another person and talking about how you really feel. What's really going on? How do we as a country actually get through this? Whether you have a podcast that you want to make more attractive to high-profile guests, or you're a podcaster that wants to be featured on other podcasts as a guest, I'd be happy to help you create the strategy and help you win in whatever you are doing. I'll have a link for my hourly consulting in the episode descriptions. You can also reach out to me at morgan@morganfranklin.media. So that's morgan@morganfranklin.media. I also have my digital product shop. Those are templates that I have created that I use every day as a podcaster, that I use for my podcasting clients. That will be linked below, or you can go to podcastforprofit.com. And as always, I can't wait to listen to your podcast. Hey, thank you so much for joining me on this episode. If you enjoyed the podcast and you'd like to hear more episodes like this one, go ahead and subscribe to the show. New episodes air every Monday morning. And if you found this episode valuable and you want to help other business owners and podcasters, will you leave me a 5-star review? It helps the show rank higher in the charts and brings more entrepreneurs the information they need to start making money on their podcast.